So, one understanding that a lot of people have about Joseph Smith's relationship with Fanny Alger is they think that it's clear that it was an affair. They think that it's well known that Joseph had an affair with her, and then later on, he wants to rebrand it as polygamy. Now, there are a few problems with this view, and it's a view that people come to maybe naturally because they think that there's actually a source where Oliver Cowdery said that Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger had an affair. Now, I thought so at one time myself, right? So when I was doing extensive research years ago on gathering all the known sources on Joseph Smith and polygamy, I was looking at a source that's been really wide. It's probably the most widely cited source in the world about Joseph Smith's relationship with Fanny Alger. You can find it all over the internet, right? Had been cited for decades. The source has Oliver Cowdery saying in a letter to his brother that he and Joseph Smith had discussed a quote, dirty, nasty, filthy affair of Joseph's and Fanny Alger's. So because I was aware of this source, I tried to look up the most original version of it that was available to me at that time, which was at the LDS Church Archives on microfilm. And when I looked, what I saw is there's something puzzling in the source. So the letter is actually written in what's called a letter book. So when people in the 1800s would write letters, if they wanted to keep a copy of their own letter, they didn't have photocopiers. So they would actually copy the letter or have a scribe copy the letter for them into a book where they would keep the text of the original letter, and then they would send the actual letter off. And so Oliver's letter to his brother about Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger is in that book, a copy of it. In the copy that's there, it does have the word affair, but what I noticed on the microfilm is that the word affair was written over top of another word. And that made me really curious because this seemed like such a key word. If Oliver Cowdery was saying Joseph and Fanny had an affair, but that wasn't the original word that he wrote, what was the original word? Was it something with a significantly different meaning? So I had a friend go to the Huntington Library in California to look at the actual original letter books where he was able to read the underlying word better, and he and I were able to figure out fully what it was, and then we were able to get high-quality scans, high-resolution scans from the Huntington Library to see that word underneath. The original word was scrape. Okay, so when Oliver Cowdery wrote this letter, he referred to a scrape between Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger. And then when Oliver's nephew copied it, he copied the word as Oliver had written it, but then he changes it. Now, why would he have changed it? So it turns out that the word scrape in the original 1828 Webster's, 10 years before Oliver wrote this letter, or also in the 1844 Webster's, just 6 years after Oliver wrote this letter, the word scrape is defined as like a perplexity or distress, kind of like a mess. So what Oliver actually says originally is that Joseph and Fanny had gotten themselves into a filthy mess, basically. Now, why does the nephew change the word to affair, and what did he mean by changing it? Well, one thing to realize is that in changing it to affair, he actually wasn't saying, as our modern ears hear it, that they were having an adulterous relationship. That word affair has that connotation for us. Did not have that connotation at the time. So you can look in the dictionaries from the 1800s, and the word affair doesn't have that definition. You can look at how the word is used. You can look at, I've looked in databases of documents from the 1800s. The word affair actually is defined in the dictionary of the time as just like a word indicating any sort of transaction, any event or happening between people. And it says explicitly in the Webster's Dictionary that it's a very vague word. It's a very general word. It acquires its present sense of an adulterous relationship around 1900. So this is about 6 decades after Oliver writes his letter and his nephew changes the word. The reason the nephew would have changed the word is that Webster also notes that the word scrape is not a polite word. It was a sort of slang word. And so what Oliver's nephew is actually trying to do is he's trying to make his uncle's writing more formal, more proper. So when people have the impression that Joseph Smith's relationship with Fanny Alger was clearly an extramarital affair, in part they're relying on the Oliver Cowdery letter that has been changed from its original wording that did not say affair, right? And they're also often relying on just what they've heard from other people. And so the kind of assumption that many people have is that it's just like basically a known fact of Mormon history that Joseph Smith had an extramarital affair with Fanny Alger. And I think they assume that this is what the actual scholars who've looked into this believe. Now, I know of 4 scholars who, in the last 30, 35 years or so, have published on Joseph Smith's relationship with Fanny Alger, either published articles or discussed the relationship extensively in books. The 4 that I can think of are Brian Hales, Todd Compton, myself, and Dan Vogel. Something that's interesting about those 4 scholars is they cover a very wide spectrum ideologically, and like in terms of religious belief and worldview. So Brian Hales, I think, would readily be identified as sort of conservative Latter-day Saint, sort of moderate conservative Latter-day Saint believer. Todd Compton would be a more liberal Latter-day Saint believer who has written extensively about Joseph Smith and polygamy, but actually does not believe that Joseph Smith's polygamy was a revelation, does not believe that it was divinely inspired. I am a former non-believer, now believer. I would say maybe in some ways kind of a third way approach. And then Dan Vogel is an ex-Mormon, and essentially he might describe himself as agnostic, but I think probably he would say atheist. And he thinks that Joseph Smith was not a prophet. He was actually a pious fraud. He thinks Joseph Smith was making things up, often, sometimes for religious reasons, but more often opportunistically. So you have 4 different worldview approaches, 4 different religious approaches. But what is it that these 4 scholars, when they've written about Joseph Smith's relationship with Fanny Alger, what have they concluded? Every single one of them, in their writings about this, after examining the evidence, has concluded that Joseph Smith's relationship with Fanny Alger was a polygamous marriage. So when people have the assumption that what the history shows and what the scholars think is that, and when people think that it's obvious that Joseph Smith had an extramarital affair with Fanny Alger, then why is it that all of the actual scholars who look into it closely conclude the opposite and conclude that it was a plural marriage?